Constantinople, the queen of cities, capital of the Roman Empire in the east, economic powerhouse of Byzantium, and the jewel in the crown of medieval Christendom. Boasting a population of up to 800,000 people at its height, and undoubtedly the largest city in the Western world throughout the Middle Ages, Constantinople was a megapolis that dominated the imagination of Byzantine citizens and those beyond the borders alike. The city was home to vast markets, enormous guild-led industries, wide avenues, grand palaces, great cathedrals and basilicas, elaborate public baths, several deep harbours, imposing fortifications, and an abundance of churches, monasteries and nunneries. But how did Constantinople, in all its imperial splendour, come to be? Just like its western cousin Rome, which famously took more than one day to complete, the answer is the accumulation of many centuries of construction, economic boom, upheaval, destruction and rebuilding, creating an ever-changing city whose physical structures reflected varied influences and histories. Constantinople, like Rome, came from humble beginnings to flourish into the pride of its empire. In this video, we shall trace the expansion and transformation of the city, from its sudden construction by the Roman Emperor Constantine, who lent the metropolis his name, to its dizzying early medieval heights, tracing its tumultuous history down to the final defeat of the Byzantine Empire at the Siege of Constantinople over 1,000 years later. This is the evolution of Constantinople. Constantinople began life in 657 BC, in quite a different guise to the grand city we typically picture. Its first occupants were not Romans, but rather Greeks, colonists who selected a headland jutting into the Sea of Marmara as the site of their new city for strategic reasons. The site sat at the crossroads of continents between Europe and Asia, overlooking the Bosphorus, the channel that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. This position allowed the settlers to take advantage of the lucrative east-west and north-south trade routes that passed through the region, ensuring the city quickly became a highly prosperous trading hub. The Greeks named their new city Byzantium. Like all Greek cities, it had its own foundation myth. The legendary leader Byzas, the son of Poseidon and grandson of the mighty Zeus. Like all Greek cities, it would have had its own outer wall, its raised acropolis, housing government buildings and temples, its public agora, its avenues and houses. Although Byzantium never achieved political influence in antiquity to rival the great cities of Corinth, Athens or Sparta, it was nevertheless prized as a rich trading city. The Persians under Darius I took the city in 512 BC, before it was liberated by a Spartan army in 478 BC. With the waning of Greek power and the ascent of Rome, Byzantium signed a treaty with the Romans in 150 BC, which guaranteed their independence in return for tribute. However, it would be the attention of Constantine the Great, the first emperor to convert to Christianity, that would change Byzantium beyond recognition. In 324, fresh from victory in the civil wars against his rivals, Constantine the Great emerged as sole emperor of the Roman Empire. The new emperor sought a new capital. Rome, despite its imperial glory, belonged to the rapidly decaying Western Empire. The East, however, was flourishing, home to the empire's richest cities. Constantine chose the strategically placed Byzantium for his Novo Roma. His city would bear his name, Constantinople. From its foundation in 324 until the year 405, the physical structure of the former Greek colony changed beyond recognition. Constantine and his successors sought to imbue the city with all the trappings befitting the imperial majesty of the Roman crown. This led to a huge expansion of the urban area. A new wall was constructed, encircling a far larger area than the old fortification. A great palace was built overlooking the Sea of Marmara. Public baths for the enjoyment of the citizens, and a grand hippodrome with seating for 80,000 spectators. Ports and granaries were constructed to support the rapidly enlarging population. A large aqueduct ran through the centre of the city, completed by the Emperor Valens in 373. An enormous avenue, known as the Mese, stretched from the Golden Gate, the marble-faced and elaborately decorated grand entrance to the city, to the centre of the city. The Mese passed through several large fora, designated as places of business and commerce: the Forum Bovis, the Forum Tauri, and the Forum of Constantine, which contained a senate house. Further along the Mese stood the Praetorium Law Court, before the Grand Avenue terminated in the Augusteum, a newly built ceremonial square. On its east side stood the city's main senate house, or curia. Constantinople soon possessed all the features of a great city of antiquity, a conscious effort by Constantine, who was well aware his changing of the imperial capital from Rome was a controversial move. The emperor even announced in 332 that free food rations would be doled out in his new city, just as they had been in Rome of old. However, there was a new element, lacking in previous ancient cities, which Constantine and his successors conspicuously introduced to Constantinople: churches. At this stage of Constantinople's development, churches were generally not built against the grain of urban development. What I mean by this is that they were, for the most part, integrated into neighbourhoods or incorporated into civic complexes, not constructed in their own dedicated areas. In this first phase of development, two of Constantinople's most iconic churches were raised: Hagia Irene and Hagia Sophia. The second phase of Constantinople's development, during the first half of the 5th century, was defined by the growing insecurity of its hinterland. The arrival of the Huns in Eastern Europe in the late 4th century, and their raiding into both the Western and Eastern Roman Empire, particularly under Attila in the 440s and 450s, precipitated defensive changes in Constantinople. The city's water supply was seen as being especially vulnerable in the event of siege, as it stretched beyond the walls of Constantine. To solve this problem, the Emperor Theodosius II embarked upon an ambitious project to build an enormous new wall system, a 60-foot-high, triple-layered defensive structure some 3.5 miles long, featuring a wide moat and 57 towers. Enlarging the city to 1,400 hectares, these fortifications, known as the Theodosian land walls, would remain undefeated until the advent of gunpowder weapons. The Mese was extended out to the new wall perimeter and a new Golden Gate constructed. In addition to the new wall, cisterns began to be added to new buildings or renovation projects. With the fall of the Western Empire in 476, Constantinople entered a new era as the undisputed capital of the Romans. This, combined with the relative political stability and economic strength, led to a population boom, increasing the population of the city to some 500,000 people during the reign of Justinian the Great. This economic prosperity brought with it another round of grand building projects, many of them the iconic buildings which we associate closely with Constantinople, and which still stand in Istanbul today. Additions to the Great Palace cemented its status as the ceremonial and administrative centre of the empire. The port of Julian on the Sea of Marmara was renovated, and remained as the primary city port for the next 300 years. Constantinople continued its urban sprawl as secular buildings of all kinds proliferated. It is also during this time that Constantinople transitioned from being a classic antique city into becoming a truly Christian metropolis. Justinian, noted for his legal reforms and successful conquests of lost Roman territories in the west, is responsible for rebuilding the Church of Hagia Sophia, damaged in the Nika riots of 532, into the enormous and stunningly beautiful building which still stands today. Upon its completion in 537, it boasted the largest interior space in the world and became the spiritual heart of the city, a magnificent example of Byzantine architecture with its vast pendentive dome. Hagia Irene and the Church of the Holy Apostles also received the Justinian treatment, being demolished and rebuilt in grand style. The Holy Apostles, located further west, was decorated with elaborate mosaics and served as the burial place for emperors until the 11th century. Churches constructed in the 5th century became important cult centres, such as the Church of Theotokos Chalkopraetia and the Church of St. Mary of Blachernae, built towards the outer edge of the Theodosian walls on the site of a holy water spring. More generally, there was a marked increase in church building across the city. However, now churches became the centres of urban neighbourhoods instead of an afterthought. They were the focal points. Many churches were associated with institutions like hospitals, old age homes, poorhouses, and schools. As a result, the spiritual life of the city grew more highly organised, with a great number of rituals and feast days binding the community together. Despite the onset of the Justinianic plague in 541 to 542, which may have carried off up to 40% of the city's population, the growth of Constantinople appears to have continued apace. It was not long before the city was once again suffering from food and water shortages, owing to its rapidly increasing population. The 7th century brought with it political upheavals and a series of trials for the city of Constantinople. The conquest of Egypt by Sasanian Persia and then Muslim Arabs deprived the city of its main source of grain. As a result, Emperor Constantine III was forced to end the free right to grain in the city in 618, shrinking the city's population somewhat. Avars and Bulgars invaded areas of the Balkans, presenting an existential threat that Constantinople had not known since the days of Attila the Hun. The city faced a series of debilitating sieges. In 626, the Avar siege of Constantinople destroyed the main aqueduct, which had to be swiftly repaired. Then, as the Muslim conquest swept westwards, the city barely repelled 2 Arab sieges, one in 674 to 678, and another 717 to 718. Although Constantinople survived, it did not come through unscathed. The empire's finances suffered badly as it rested with these military threats, and as a result there was almost no major building or restoration works between 610 and 760. The main area of settlement appears to have shrunk to within the old Constantinian civic centre and the environs of the harbour of Julian as the city's population declined. The port of Julian is the only major port mentioned in sources between the 7th and 10th centuries, indicating a slowdown in commercial traffic. Burials began to take place within the old Constantinian wall, perhaps indicating that there was now room in this area thanks to significant depopulation. Furthermore, some of the city's large civic buildings were allowed to decay. Frankish ambassadors reported basilicas without proper lighting or roofing. However, it must be pointed out that despite the clear decline in Constantinople's fortunes, the city remained relatively well maintained. The major 6th century churches were kept in good order, the Theodosian land walls were subject to extensive repair works, and Justinian II even increased the size of the Great Palace. Despite depopulation, neighbourhoods survived within the city walls as a network of semi-urban nuclei of production and consumption, scattered throughout the urban area, between the walls and throughout the suburban hinterland. Although ports along the Golden Horn became depressed, commercial activity remained relatively strong through trading emporia on the banks of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara. The year 746 brought with it a devastating outbreak of plague. However, it effectively marked the early medieval low point of Constantinople's fortunes and heralded something of a revival beginning in the reign of Constantine V, whose successful military campaigns reclaimed Cyprus for the Byzantine Empire. Depopulation had become so bad in Constantinople that Constantine repopulated the city with people from mainland Greece and the Aegean Islands, effectively beginning a period of economic growth that lasted until 1204. The population of Constantinople increased rapidly, perhaps reaching as many as 800,000 in the 9th and 10th centuries. Despite an economic and social revival, the built landscape of Constantinople did not change a great deal. The building records of 8th and 9th century emperors indicate that most major works were renovations of existing structures, with a few notable differences. Increasingly, building materials were salvaged from older structures to recreate new ones, and monastic foundations rather than churches began to proliferate. In fact, the growth of monasteries, often sponsored by officials, nobles, and even emperors, was conspicuous. Monasteries began to occupy spaces in the city's centre rather than being confined to the suburbs, and new foundations sprang up everywhere. Under the auspices of the Macedonian dynasty, Constantinople continued to flourish. The 10th century Book of the Eparch, a text detailing the organisation of the city's guilds around the office of the eparch, attests to considerable economic prosperity. In the early 11th century, Emperor Alexios Komnenos moved the imperial court to the burgeoning palace of the Blatchani, and the Golden Horn once again regained its status as a maritime centre, largely due to an influx of merchants from Venice, Pisa, Genoa and Amalfi, many of whom were granted special trade privileges by the imperial authorities. But, as with previous centuries, the actual built environment of the city did not change much. Sources can give us an idea of what the city may have looked like during this time. Interestingly, much of the city space, even within the Constantinian walls, was farmed. The sights and sounds of the countryside would have pervaded, and people would have kept livestock. Broad parks and farmlands, dotted with monasteries, villas and palaces, giving way to the impressive marble structures, bathhouses, statues and fora of the city centre. Old buildings were generally conserved with repair work, converted or else broken up to salvage materials. It is rather difficult to say whether the resulting look of the city would have been aesthetically pleasing or incongruous. In the words of Paul Magdaleno, no part of the city was entirely a recent creation, and Constantinople was probably more closely, richly, and naturally in touch with its physical origins than with any other city surviving from Greco-Roman antiquity. By this point, there was a well-developed commercial area focused on the Mese, from the Forum Tauri to the Augusteion, and leading north and south away to the shores. In this area, colonies of foreign traders could be found: Italians, Arabs, Jews, Armenians, Syrians, Rus, Georgians and Turks, each with their own neighbourhoods. It has been estimated that by the late 12th century, up to 80,000 foreigners were present in Constantinople, a considerable portion of the population, which had shrunk to some 400,000 by 1204. Unbeknownst to its inhabitants, this would represent the final flourish of Constantinople's former imperial glory. Around the advent of the 13th century, Constantinople suffered a series of misfortunes. In 1182, the massacre of the Latins killed or drove out some 60,000 foreign inhabitants of the city, damaging the economy and permanently degrading relations with the West. Then, in 1204, the Fourth Crusade turned aside from its original aim of retaking Jerusalem and made for Constantinople, at the invitation of the dethroned emperor Alexios IV Angelos. Installing Alexios on the throne, the Crusaders demanded their promised payment. When this was not forthcoming, they resolved to take it by force, breaking the city's defences on the 12th of April 1204 and subjecting Constantinople to a 3-day sack. The infamous sack of Constantinople irreversibly damaged the once great city. In an orgy of violence, the Crusaders destroyed and looted wealth and culture accumulated over centuries. Works of art which had survived from ancient Greece, holy relics, and carefully wrought crosses crafted from precious metals, sacred books and icons. All were smashed, burned, stolen, and carried off by the rampaging Crusaders. The statue of 4 bronze horses which adorned the hippodrome was taken back to Venice and placed on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. Monasteries and palaces were torn open, their inhabitants murdered, and their riches plundered. None were spared from the violence, and at the end of 3 days, Constantinople was stricken, a husk of its former self. Following the despoiling of the city, Constantinople became the seat of the Latin emperors, Crusader leaders who established an empire based in the city. Unsurprisingly, the city's Greek inhabitants fled in droves to centres of Byzantine government in exile, causing enormous depopulation. At least 1/3 of the city's people were gone almost instantaneously. Economic deprivation followed for Constantinople. Such was the poverty of the Latin emperors that they melted down statues and sold the lead roofing of the city's palaces for coin. Inevitably, none of the city's great buildings received due care and began to fall into decay. With the restoration of Greek rule under Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, new hope briefly sprang up for Constantinople. The city's population, just 35,000 in 1261, grew to 70,000 as former residents to the city were encouraged to return. The Palaiologan emperors had bold aims for Constantinople, intending to return the city to its former glory. However, they could simply not marshal the resources required to complete such a task. Territorial losses to the Turks in Anatolia shrunk the empire's coffers, and the establishment of a fortified Genoan trading colony within the suburb of Pera in Constantinople allowed foreign traders to circumvent imperial tolls. Michael VIII succeeded in restoring some symbolic structures of imperial power and piety. The walls, the Blachernae Palace, the Great Palace, Hagia Sophia, and some other churches. But his successors were barely able to maintain these buildings, let alone embark upon a fuller urban restoration. Such it was that the once great city fell into decline, becoming a semi-rural network of scattered communities within the walls. Interestingly, what little building work there was came not from the emperors, but from individual nobles, as the imperial system broke down and nobles began to operate in a more feudal style, constructing private palaces and estates. The Great Palace fell into decay as the emperors dwelt at the Blachernae on the edge of the city. The shore of the Golden Horn, controlled by Venetians, replaced the Mese as the primary commercial district. The onset of the Black Death, the rapidly dwindling territory of the empire, civil wars, and military defeats further diminished the wealth of Constantinople. So desperate was the decline that in its final years, the once great city had a population of just 50,000. The urban elite, cloistered in their hillside estates, abandoned the heart of the old city to its seemingly inevitable decay. Visitors describe a ghostly city made up of a series of villages, more empty than full. When, on the 29th of May 1453, the city fell to the Ottoman Turks under Mehmet II, it was no more than a shell of its former glory. So ended Byzantine Constantinople, a city synonymous with the medieval Byzantine Empire. The antique Roman foundations, the imperial majesty, and the tragic fall of the empire are all reflected in the city of Constantinople throughout the medieval period. Constantinople itself would find new life as the seat of power of the Ottoman sultans and the centre of the Ottoman Empire, which itself would come to an end with the disastrous decision of Mehmed V to enter the First World War on the side of the Central Powers. Although it goes by a new name, Istanbul, the remnants of old Constantinople can still be seen today: the Theodosian land walls, the Aqueduct of Valens, and of course the great Hagia Sophia. At risk of sounding mawkish, there is something about Constantinople that appeals to us. It can represent a microcosm of the medieval Byzantine Empire at large. Perhaps it is Constantinople's Roman past that interests us, for the city also carried with it the continuation of the dramatic solemnity of the Roman Empire of old. But then again, maybe it is simply the poetic romance of a lost city which we find so intriguing. An image of a decaying civilization that was so beloved of 19th century Romanticism, a place whose traces remain imprinted upon its later iterations, but which is simultaneously quite unlike that which exists today. Whatever the reason for our fascination with it, Constantinople remains, as it always was, a city that captures the imagination.